do we mean by politics? How do we define this term? Are we defining it theologically, legally, ethically? How do those kind of broaden or spread such that we can have a really good understanding for whatever the Lord is calling us to do as we interact in life? So I do want to start with Caitlin again, and then we'll go around the group.
Thanks, Sally. That's one of my favorite questions because I spend a lot of my time talking to both students and to pastors about politics and faith. And the very first thing I feel like I have to say, very in line with what John said is, okay, what are we talking about when we say politics? Because typically if a church invites me to come and talk about politics, the people in the church will come and be ready to talk about the next national election, probably who they're going to vote for president, and or whatever is in their particular area, the hot button thing at that moment. And I always have to start with this kind of definitional question because I think not only is it important for us to get our terms right, but it can lower the temperature a little bit if we start with just kind of understanding what politics is in a really broad way. You could by politics mean just the legislative kind of process or the process of voting, elected officials. You could kind of mean the procedure of politics. When I use that term, and I think a lot of times we use it in this kind of looser way, just means how we build a common life together. Even the root of the word in polis, right, just meaning cities, like there's a sense in which, yes, when I just voted yesterday in a primary election in North Carolina. I went to the church across the street from me. I literally walked over there, walked in. The person checking me in lives in my community, lives down the street from me. I got to meet him and talk. It was this moment of politics in a very procedural sense. I went and filled in some bubbles, hoped I made good choices that were educated and helped serve my community. But I also was doing politics in the sense of stopping and having this conversation with someone who lives in my neighborhood who has unique concerns. Kids are in the public school system here. There's concerns about affordable housing in my area. So building that relationship, hopefully with the end of both getting to know him as an image bearer, but also with the end of living well in my community. If something happens on my street, there's a loud party happening or there's some violence in the street, I can kind of choose to call the police. That might be the right option depending on what's happening. But I also, if I've built good relationships with that community, that's a different way of solving disputes in my community that is still political in the sense that it has to do with how we live well together, and especially in ways that can prevent harm from happening to people in my communities, especially kind of the material harm that happens in communities that are especially vulnerable. So it's helpful for us, I think, to think about politics in that very general sense, not only, like I said, so that we know that all of these issues are political, and that doesn't make them dirty or wrong or partisan. It doesn't mean it's just about the party that we're voting for, the politician we support. It just means we're working together to solve problems in our community. But hopefully, again, lowering the temperature to just say, I am doing something political when I build relationships in my community. And that is a God-honoring thing to do that responds well to Jesus' command to love my neighbor.
Wow. Okay, Caitlin. Well, you've really brought into working for the common good. That's fantastic. So we can all go home now because it's, or at least we should talk to our neighbors more. I really, that's encouraging to me. Okay, Glenn, how about you? We'll go in the next order here.
That's so brilliant, Caitlin. What I heard from you is you said, politics is about the procedures, but it's also about the people. And then, of course, it's also about specific policies. And maybe at some level it goes down into parties. I would add another P word, the preacher in me coming out here, and say it's also about power. And there's a big sense in which this is about power and how power is used, the right ordering of society, so that power is either distributed or exercised in a way that results in flourishing. And I think as a pastor, we ought to be very interested in power as Christians, actually, because the gospel is the gospel of the kingdom. And to use that phrase, to say the kingdom of God, automatically we're talking about several things. But when you say kingdom, you're at the very least talking about authority and allegiance. So you're talking about a king who has ultimate authority here. And then you're talking about allegiance. To whom do we owe our ultimate allegiance? So when we get into these conversations about politics, it's very important to recognize that there are power issues here. And often what people mean when they say, let's get political, is they're trying to use the machinery of the state as a means of power towards a certain end. And when we think of it that way, then we can start to reflect biblically and theologically on how power should be used. And is the machinery of the state the right instrument to be used towards the ends that we hope for?
Wow. Okay. So still staying big, still, we're going to get into some nitty gritty. I'm seeing some questions too about, can we do this? Can we do that legally? So we'll address that, but it is good to set up this framework and to think about, right, the distribution of power, exercise of power, and then how that plays out, the means to the ends. And really that's kind of the fundamental of politics, isn't it? That we've got, I think I said, Aristotle said, politics is the master science on which all branches of human activity depends. So it's that outworkings, right, of how we understand authority and the workings of our society. All right, John, how about you next?
Yeah, that as we talk about politics and our role in it, right, I specifically, as I think about it, want to narrow it to the unique privileges and responsibilities that we have here in the US, right? It's the reason why it's hard to have it would be hard to have a global webinar on politics just because other countries don't have the same powers that we do. So when I think of it in terms of how do we talk about leveraging our unique power and responsibility as a citizen to love our neighbor by guiding the government towards human flourishing, right? So what is our unique power and responsibility to do that? And our goal is to love our neighbor by being an advocate, by using our power and responsibility to guide the government towards what we believe to be human flourishing.
Wow. Okay, that's deep. So we're guiding the government toward human flourishing. And that makes all the sense in the world then to get involved in politics,
Absolutely.
Right? Because we can do that. So
Yep.
I'm going to just give a little brief primer and dive in right before Eric. I don't want to steal Eric's thunder here, but and then you can build on that however you want, because there's always, well, what does that mean? Can we do this? Can we do that? I mean, based on these kinds of definitions, churches should all get political or never go, never talk about a candidate again, because maybe it's just not a good idea because we want to stay broad, or somewhere in between. Okay, so from a legal perspective, as a 501c3, if you're a church, you're automatically a 501c3. Other ministries would probably be 501c3s, and they're absolutely prohibited from engaging in political campaign activity. So the IRS does not think about flourishing toward the common good, other than to say, well, that's what a 501c3 is quintessentially for, is to do good stuff, and however we kind of decide that is. But don't cross the line, that's the Johnson Amendment, into political campaign activity. Okay, so does the IRS even enforce this? Not really, as Eric said, which I think creates kind of a disrespect for the law. Or if the IRS gets involved, now the IRS is messing around with churches, which is very uncomfortable I think for a lot of folks. And it's, there's kind of this chilling effect. Well, what do we even mean by political campaign activity? And I kind of beat a drum on this. It's not educational issue advocacy. Educational issue advocacy is quintessentially changing hearts and minds. And you can fill in the blank on any kind of moral issue you want. How are we supposed to think about something? Sharing information, most likely in matters of public policy, and that's where the intersection is with politics. So 501c3s can speak out on the environment, on poverty, on housing, on abortion, a whole host of issues that affect our world through this lens of educational issue advocacy, helping people to understand how to think or what to think, or here's some more data on what to consider. It's also not lobbying, which is basically trying to enact or overturn legislation. Might even include a ballot initiative, because that's effectively voters going to change the law, or things like, call your legislator today and tell them this. That's the 501c3s can do some of that, but not too much. So there's kind of this question of, do we even get involved? Is it a good idea to go for or against? And this prohibition is really about advocating for or against a political candidate, such as to encourage them to vote for or against, or expressing approval or disapproval, with lots and lots of nuances. And that's where people get, kind of nervous. Should they do this? Should they not? And that's kind of that lay of the land. So if you want to do a voter guide and say, here's a whole host of issues, maybe you want to do that. But if you're a single issue organization and you're all about X fill in the blank issue, probably not do a voter guide, because you're telling people who to vote for implicitly, if not expressly. So I just needed to put that out there and kind of hone it in. Eric, feel free to build on whatever you'd like to from all of that.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that, Sally. And I think that when we start to talk about the issue of the law and what churches can and cannot do, it can very quickly kind of descend into a little bit of a head spinning kind of, okay, well, what does this mean? And when is it a campaign? And, you know, if you delve into the IRS regulations, the question about when someone becomes a candidate is really a nuanced kind of answer about, well, it's when somebody else offers them to be a candidate and those kind of things. The IRS has made, you know, statements over the years, and you know that churches cannot directly or indirectly participate in a campaign, but we don't really know what an indirect participation means. And so all of that to say that that was what led up to kind of the issue that I started in on 2008, really to address that issue of you know, if you look back over the history of the IRS enforcement of the Johnson Amendment, it's been very spotty. It's been very uneven. At times, they will take what they call a guidance posture. At other times, they'll take what they call an enforcement posture, meaning that they'll ramp up enforcement efforts against some churches or 501c3s. And you know, right now, I think we're kind of in a guidance posture where the IRS is kind of sitting back a little more relaxed, and they're not taking some strict enforcement efforts. My point is, I think that can change over the years, but I don't think that it's something that churches need to be concerned about, given the constitutional protections that churches have. For those that are interested, I did write a piece that's up on Church Law and Tax about the constitutional protections that churches have in this particular area. And my admonition and kind of encouragement for churches, when you think about the law and you think about the legal do's and don'ts, voter guides, candidate appearances at church, all of these kinds of things, is to primarily think about that as a theological matter. How does that informed by your theology, by your faith, by your community, by what you as a church leader feel that your people need? So think about it primarily that way, and then and only then turn to the legal issues. And there are great resources to help you navigate that, if you know, on kind of the ins and outs of this. But there are also great constitutional protections involved for churches as well. My biggest, I think the only thing I'll add to the question about, you know, what is political is just a concern that from the government's perspective, too often what happens is someone in the government may slap a political label on things and thereby say, well, now the law makes this out of bounds for churches to address. I think that's dangerous. I think that's something that churches ought to be concerned about and really should resist, kind of, because the definition is so open and malleable that to allow kind of someone in an enforcement ability to slap a political label and tell churches to stay out is you know, it is concerning. So that's my encouragement. Think about it theologically first, legally second. Recognize the resources that are there to help in this area.